Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aizal Timadera from BSN English 3B, and today we are going to talk about task designing and scoring rubrics for process-oriented performance-based assessment. Learning tasks need to be carefully planned. In particular, the teacher must ensure that the particular learning process to be observed contributes to the overall understanding of the subject or course. Some generally accepted standard for a designing task includes identifying an activity that would highlight the competencies to be evaluated. For example, reciting a poem, writing an essay, and manipulating the microscope. Second is identifying an activity that would entail more or less the same set of competencies. If an activity would result into many possible competencies, then the teacher would have difficulty assessing the student's competency on the task. And lastly is finding a task that will be interesting and enjoyable for the students. Tasks such as writing an essay are often boring and cumbersome for the students. For example, the topic is understanding biological diversity. So this is the possible task design. Bring the students to a pond or a creek. Ask them to find all living organisms as they can find living near the pond or creek. Also, bring them to the school playground to find as many living organisms as they can. Observe how the students will develop a system for finding such organisms, classifying the organism, and concluding the differences in biological diversity of the two sites. So, why do we need to have task designing in classroom assessment? At the heart of designing or choosing assessment tasks for a unit is remembering that in addition to promoting the student learning, their purpose is to provide opportunities for students to demonstrate how well they have achieved or are progressing towards achieving the intended learning outcomes of the unit. Moving on, let's now have the scoring rubrics for process-oriented performance-based assessment. Rubric is a scoring scale used to assess student performance along a task-specific set of criteria. Authentic assessment are typically criterion reference measure, that is, a student's aptitude on a task is determined by matching the student's performance against a set of criteria to determine the degree to which the student's performance meet the criteria for the task. To measure student performance against a predetermined set of criteria, a rubric or scoring scale which contains the essential criteria for the task and appropriate level of performance for each criterion is typically created. For example, this following rubric covers the recitation portion of a task in English. As in the example, a rubric is comprised of two components, criteria and levels of performance. Each rubric has at least two criteria and at least two levels of performance. The criteria, characteristic of good performance on a task are listed in the left column in the rubric above. Actually, as is a common in rubrics, a shorthand is used for each criterion to make it fit easily into the table. The full criteria are statements of performance such as include a sufficient number of hand gestures and recitation captures the ambience through appropriate feelings and tone of the voice. For each criterion, the evaluator applying the rubric can determine to what degree the student has met the criterion. For example, the level of performance. In the rubric, there are three levels of performance for each criterion. These are the recitation can contain a lot of inappropriate, few inappropriate, or no inappropriate hand gestures. Finally, the rubric above contains a mechanism for assigning a score to each project. And the second to the left column, a weight is assigned in each criterion. Students can receive 1, 2, or 3 points per number of sources. But appropriate ambience, more important in the teacher's mind, is weighed 3 times as heavily. So student can receive 3, 6, or 9 points. Example is 1, 2, 3, or times 3 for the level of appropriateness in this task. Descriptors. The above rubric includes another common but not a necessary component of rubrics, which is descriptors. Descriptors spell out what is expected of student at each level of performance for each criterion. In the previous example, lots of historical inappropriate hand gestures, monotone voice use are descriptors. A descriptor tells students more precisely what looks like at each level and how their work may be distinguished from the work of others for each criterion. Similarly, the descriptors help the teacher more precisely and consistently distinguish between students' works. So, why include levels of performance? We include levels of performance for clearer expectation so that students know what is expected of them and teachers know what to look for in students' performance. Also, for more consistent and objective assessment. Levels of performance permit to teacher to more consistently and objectively distinguish between good and bad performance, or between superior, mediocre, and poor performance when evaluating the student. And lastly is for better feedback. Identifying levels of performance allows teacher to provide more detailed feedback to students. And that's all for my report. I hope you've learned something. Thank you for listening and have a great day.